So probably the best thing about the new RTX 3080 Ti, to me anyway, is that it's the most powerful dual slot graphics card in existence. Like the 3080, there are actually a few ITX cases out there where this cooler design does make sense and can be cooled pretty effectively. And as we saw in yesterday's performance review, this is just not really worth it from a performance and value standpoint. You're paying an extra $500 on top of an RTX 3080, and you're only really getting an extra 7 to 10% performance back in return. But as I did mention in that review, we are in some really weird times with the GPU market. Perhaps that $500 difference really isn't reflected in the real world, and so maybe you are actually interested in the 3080 Ti. And in that case, do you go for the compact 2-slot model, or do you go for something much larger? That's what we're taking a look at today. So essentially here we have three different tiers of graphics cards from the same model. We have the 3080 Ti Founders Edition, then a step up from that we have the Asus TUF OC, and then an example of a top tier card, at least when it comes to pricing and specs, is the Supreme X from MSI. When it comes to the real world and the current market, you can also expect some pretty noticeable price differences between these cards as well. Typically, Nvidia FE cards can be had for MSRP at a retailer such as Best Buy in the US, in this case $1,200, but the price of board partner cards is really anyone's guess at this point. Now, apart from availability and the price of these cards, which, let's be honest, is probably the primary factor in which one will end up in your system, the physical size of the cards is probably next in line in terms of importance. While the 3080 Ti FE will pretty much fit anywhere, the TUF OC does at least need to be checked against the case that you're putting it in. It comes in at 300 mils in length and 127 mils in height with 2.5 slots in thickness, so compact mid-tower cases with a front-mounted radiator and a set of fans might be eating into your potential graphics card length a bit too much. Then we have the Supreme X, which is one of the biggest graphics cards ever released. At 336 mils in length and 140 mils in height, ITX is mostly out of the question, and even when it comes to a mid-tower build, that total length does need to be taken into consideration as well. So what does performance look like then out of the box? Well, we can't just take a look at clock speeds or thermals alone, because different graphics card models often run with different power limits. For the 3080 Ti Founders Edition, we're looking at an average of 1808 MHz towards the end of this 30-minute benchmark, with an average GPU power of 347 watts. The Asus TUF OC is a bit better here, about 30 MHz faster at a slightly lower power consumption as well. But the MSI Supreme X is probably the wildest GPU out of these three. At stock, it settles to around 1930 MHz while pulling a monstrous 392 watts. So yeah, there's clearly a reason here that this card has three 8-pin power connectors. But what does that mean in terms of gaming performance? Well, the Founders Edition and the TUF OC will be pretty much even. There's not much clock speed separating those two, but the factory OC on the Supreme X allows it to overtake the RTX 3090. In the end, that gives us around a 3% lead over the FE. It's not much, but it's at least something. And then when it comes to overclocking, I didn't experiment or waste too much time on this, mostly due to the fact that it's always a bit disappointing on 30 series GPUs anyway, given the lack of voltage control and how much power we're already pulling. As for the power limits though, which you can raise in MSI Afterburner, all three of these cards do have a little bit of headroom, 114% on the FE, 107% for the Asus TUF OC, and 110% for the already boosted MSI Supreme X. That means the Supreme X can be raised to a power limit of 440 watts. I'm not kidding, that's actually insane, but good luck making use of all of that power without any real voltage control. Alright, but now let's take a look at the thermal and noise performance difference between these three cards. So as we saw in the initial 3080 Ti review, the Founders Edition cooler manages the GPU pretty well at around 74 degrees C with the room ambient of 21, and it does that with the fans at 1950 RPM. The TUF OC though runs a whole lot cooler. It has both a larger heatsink and an extra fan, so we're looking at about a 9-degree reduction here in GPU temp at roughly the same fan speed. As for the Supreme X, it runs within a pretty safe range as well, especially while pulling close to 400 watts continuously and having the lowest fan speed of the three as well. Now focus on that graph over on the left there, because so far we've just been taking a look at the average GPU temperature, but when we switch over to the GPU hotspot temperature, the differences grow a little more. This might be due to the different mounting and cold plate surfaces used on the different heatsinks. Then when we take a look at the differences in the memory hotspot temperature, there's a clear difference here between the Founders Edition and the two cards from the board partners. Memory clock throttling cooling occurs at 110 degrees C here for the 3080 Ti, and we are a bit off that, but if you're putting this in a less than ideal case and you live in a warm climate, then that might be a problem that you'd encounter with the FE. So as you probably would have guessed, bigger heatsinks, better thermal pads equals better cooling. Here's an idea of how they all sound at stock after 30 minutes of running Heaven 4.0. Then when we do a noise normalized thermal test, the differences don't really change that much at all. All three cards get about a 1 to 2 degree reduction, but the ordering stays the same. With this chart, we can say for certain that the Tough OC is noticeably better than the 2-slot FE card, since clocks and power are very similar here and noise levels are equal. The bigger heatsink and triple fan setup on the Tough OC allows it to run around 10 degrees cooler on average. And then comparing the Tough OC to the Supreme X, the real thermal performance between them is probably very similar. Sure, the Supreme X is running 8 degrees warmer here in this noise normalized test, but it's also running 100 megahertz faster and pulling over 50 watts more. So I think what I was most interested to see here was how the 2-slot Founders Edition cooler would stack up against something like a Tough OC, where you have similar power, similar clocks, but a very different heatsink design and a much bigger heatsink with a triple fan setup on the Tough OC. And I think the FE card did okay. Would I recommend this for an RTX setup? Generally, probably not, especially at 350 watts, but there are a few RTX cases that will do it. This chart here shows the 3080 and how that performs in a range of different RTX cases. So for the 3080 Ti, basically just add 2 degrees and some extra noise to each result. Or you could consider these results for the 3080 Ti if you did a small undervolt and brought the power closer to 320 watts. So really anything above the NCase M1 should work quite well here for the 3080 Ti FE, as those cases support the flow-through cooler design quite well. And of course, just stating the obvious here, the most important spec here is not the size of the card, how many fans it has, and what clock speed it runs at, but instead the pricing and availability. Can you actually buy these cards, and what can you get them for? Because we used to be having this discussion of whether this card would be worth the extra $80 or whether that one would be worth the $120. But that conversation is just completely irrelevant in today's market. Obviously, an FE card at MSRP would be ideal if your country actually sells them, and the next best thing would probably be a board partner card like the Tough OC. Who knows how much cards like the Supreme X, the ROG Strix, or the Aorus Master will go for these days, but at least for the 3080 Ti, I'd say those are easily close to the $2,000 mark. So hopefully you found this useful. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.